In the summer of 1879, an assayer named Silas Kerrigan climbed down the shaft of a small independent claim called the Alpine on the southern reaches of the Comstock Lode, and did not expect to find anything worth writing home about. The Alpine was not one of the celebrated mines of Virginia City, Nevada. It sat in the shadow of the Consolidated Virginia and the California, the two mines whose combined ore body had already produced more than $100 million and made 4 ordinary men into the wealthiest speculators on the Pacific coast. The Alpine was a modest operation, a few dozen men, a single hoisting works, a shaft that by that summer had reached a depth where the rock itself held heat like a banked stove. Kerrigan's job was simple in principle and brutal in practice. Ore came up from below in canvas sacks, hot enough in places to blister an ungloved hand, and he reduced it in his assay office to a bead of metal that told the company, in exact terms, what the ground was worth. On a night in late June, according to the fragments of the story that survive, a sack came up from a new drift on the lower level that assayed differently than anything the Alpine had produced before. Kerrigan ran the sample twice. Both times the crucible gave him the same answer. He wrote the figure down. And then, as far as any surviving company record, county filing, or mint deposit book can show, he never told anyone what it was. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The company minute books for the Alpine Mining Company, held today in fragments among the Comstock collections at the University of Nevada, Reno, show a routine entry for the last week of June, noting only that development work continued on the lower level and that assay results would be reported at the next meeting of the board. No such report appears in the minutes that follow. The ledger simply moves on to July, to timber costs and pump repairs, as though the entry had never been promised. The Carson City Mint, the federal facility built specifically to receive and coin the bullion of the Comstock, kept a deposit register logging every batch of silver and gold brought in by every company on the lode. The Alpine appears in that register periodically through the spring of that year, in modest, unremarkable amounts. After the last week of June, the Alpine does not appear in the Carson City Mint's deposit register again for the remainder of 1879. Whatever Kerrigan found, if he found anything at all, appears to have gone nowhere, not into the company's books, not into the federal government's own accounting of the metal coming out of the ground. The record simply stops. To understand why a filed assay report, an ordinary piece of paperwork produced by the hundreds every week across the Comstock, could vanish without a trace, it helps to understand what the Comstock had become by 1879, and what an assay actually meant to the people who depended on it. The Comstock Lode had been discovered 20 years earlier, in 1859, when prospectors working a gold claim in what is now Gold Hill found themselves cursing a heavy blue-grey clay that fouled their sluice boxes and refused to wash away with the gold. A sample of that clay, sent for assay, came back showing a concentration of silver sulfide no one working the claim had thought to expect. The rush that followed built Virginia City out of a tent camp into a city of 25,000 people within 15 years, with its own stock exchange, its own newspapers, its own railroad connecting it to the transcontinental line at Reno. By 1873, the Comstock had produced its single greatest discovery, an ore body inside the Consolidated Virginia and California mines that came to be called the Big Bonanza. The 4 men who controlled it, John Mackay, James Fair, James Flood, and William O'Brien, had learned of the discovery's true scale before the general public did, and they used that window of private knowledge to buy up depressed shares of their own companies on the San Francisco Stock Exchange before announcing what they had found. When the announcement came, the stock did not simply rise, it became one of the great speculative events in American financial history, and it made the 4 men, collectively, some of the richest people in the country. That story was not a scandal on the Comstock. It was common knowledge, discussed openly in the mining press once the fortune was already made, and it established something like a working assumption among the men who ran the district's smaller companies, from the largest bonanza firms down to claims the size of the Alpine. An assay report was not merely a scientific measurement, it was market information, and market information had a price, and the price was highest to the man who possessed it before anyone else did. Later historians of the district, working from surviving company records and the mining press of the period, have generally described a stock exchange where this kind of advanced knowledge was treated less as an ethical failing than as one more resource to be extracted from the ground, alongside the silver and the gold itself. The apparatus for recording and moving that information was substantial. Each company kept its own assay office, typically a single room with a furnace, a set of crucibles, cupels of bone ash, and the litharge and borax used in the fire assay process that had changed little since the 16th century. A sample was crushed, weighed, fluxed, and fired, and the resulting bead of precious metal was weighed against a sample of known purity to calculate the ore's value per ton. The assayer's word was, in practice, the only word that mattered, because almost no one else on the mine's payroll had the training to check it. His figures went to the superintendent, the superintendent's figures went to the board in San Francisco, and the board's public statements moved the price of stock on an exchange where fortunes changed hands in an afternoon. The Carson City Mint, 30 miles to the south, sat at the far end of that chain, receiving the physical bullion that the Assays had promised and converting it into coin. Its own deposit ledgers were meant to be an independent check on the whole system, a federal record that did not depend on any single company's honesty. In practice, as historians of the Mint have since documented, that check had limits. Companies controlled when and how much bullion they brought in. A discovery could sit unrecorded for weeks while insiders positioned themselves in the market, and nothing in the Mint's own procedures would show that anything had been withheld, only that a shipment had not yet arrived. Between the assay office and the Mint sat the San Francisco stock exchanges, where shares in Comstock companies traded every day the market was open, and where a single telegram from Virginia City could send a stock up or down by half its value before lunch. Men who had never set foot in a mine shaft built fortunes and lost them on the strength of numbers wired down from assay offices exactly like Kerrigan's, and the culture that grew up around those numbers was not always an honest one. Western mining camps had already produced their share of outright fraud, claims salted with ore hauled in from richer ground to fool a buyer, assay results manufactured wholesale to inflate a stock long enough for insiders to sell before the truth came out. The Comstock's own newspapers, the Territorial Enterprise chief among them, made something of a specialty out of exposing these schemes when they could, though a silence was far harder to expose than a lie, since a silence left no forged document behind for a reporter to find. What Kerrigan is alleged to have found was not, by the surviving fragments of the story, a fraud of that kind at all. If the ore was real, the only deception, if there was one, lay in what was left unsaid, and to whom and when. The year 1879 sat at a particularly unstable point in that system. The big bonanza had peaked and was declining. Comstock stocks, which had traded at wild valuations in 1875, had crashed in the years since, wiping out thousands of small investors who had bought in at the top. The great mines were chasing their ore bodies ever deeper into ground where two problems grew worse with every 100 feet: water and heat. Rock temperatures on the lode rose by roughly 2 degrees Celsius for every 30 meters of depth, a pattern the mining engineer John A. Church had documented in a paper published in the American Journal of Science that same year, describing miners working in chambers where the thermometer read 115 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men in those chambers worked stripped to the waist and chewed lumps of ice by the handful, and drank water so cold it should have stopped their hearts and somehow did not, retreating every so often to cooling stations a level or two above where the temperature dropped to a merely brutal 100 degrees. It was in this environment, a year or two later, that the geologist George Becker arrived to conduct the field survey that would become the United States Geological Survey's formal study of the district, published in 1882 as Monograph 3. And it was this same environment that Kerrigan worked in nightly, running his crucibles in a room where the ore itself sometimes arrived too hot to hold. Water was, if anything, the larger threat. Floods in the lower levels had drowned men and equipment for years, and in 1869, a fire in the Yellow Jacket mine, fed by timbers and fanned by the mine's own ventilation shafts, had killed dozens of miners trapped below ground with no second way out. That disaster was part of what finally justified Adolf Sutro's long campaign to build a drainage and ventilation tunnel nearly 4 miles long, running from the Carson River Valley up into the heart of the Comstock's deep workings. The Sutro Tunnel's main bore had connected to the Savage mine in the fall of 1878. Its remaining branches were finished the following year, and on the 30th of June 1879, the accumulated water of the lower Comstock was released through the tunnel for the first time. That date sits within days of the entry in the Alpine's minute book, promising an assay report that never appears again. The valley that summer was, in other words, a place where enormous volumes of water, heat, and information were all moving at once, some of it through engineered channels built for the purpose, and some of it, perhaps, through channels no one ever intended to leave a record of. There was also the matter of what had happened 4 years earlier, on the 26th of October 1875, when a lamp knocked over in a boarding house on A Street started a fire that burned for 9 hours and destroyed 3/4 of Virginia City. The Great Fire took the International Hotel, Piper's Opera House, St. Mary's in the Mountains, and the Story County Courthouse, along with whatever records the courthouse held at the time. The city rebuilt within a year, brick replacing timber in most of the business district, but the fire had already demonstrated something the men of the Comstock did not need demonstrated twice. Paper records in a boomtown were never as permanent as the men who kept them liked to believe. A courthouse could burn, a company could dissolve, a ledger could simply stop being kept once the men who cared about its contents had gotten what they needed from it. What, then, did the ore itself show on the night Kerrigan ran his crucible twice and got the same answer both times? The surviving fragments of the story, pieced together from the company's partial minute book, the Mint's deposit register, and a small collection of family correspondence that surfaced generations later, describe the material pulled from the Alpine's lower drift as heavy with native silver wire and dark ruby silver, the mineral miners called stephanite, threaded through a matrix of quartz that the mine's own geology gave no particular reason to expect at that depth. The standard ore of the district ran a modest number of ounces to the ton, enough to justify the cost of hoisting and milling, but rarely enough to make a company famous on its own. Even the celebrated bonanza ore bodies were not uniform, running through pockets of astonishing richness, surrounded by far larger volumes of rock that barely paid the cost of extraction, which is precisely why a single assay result, taken from a single sack pulled from a single new drift, could mean everything or nothing depending on how much of that pocket the drift had actually reached. What Kerrigan is said to have logged that night ran to a figure high enough that, if genuine, and if reported honestly to the board, it would have transformed the Alpine overnight from an unremarkable claim on the district's edge into the most valuable property on the southern Comstock. It would have been, in the language of the period, a bonanza in miniature, arriving at almost the exact moment the district most needed one. Comstock stocks were depressed. Investors who had been burned by the 1875 collapse were wary of any new claim. And the Carson City Mint itself was, that autumn, running out of silver to coin. Mint records show that by the 1st of November 1879, the vault at Carson City held only a little over 12,000 ounces of standard bullion, a value of roughly $14,000, so little that coinage was formally suspended. The mint stayed open to purchase bullion, but it struck no new coin for nearly 6 months, until the spring of the following year, when shipments finally rebuilt its reserves enough to resume. A rich strike announced in that window, at that moment, with the mint itself starved for metal and the market hungry for any reason to believe the Comstock had one more bonanza left in it, would not have been a quiet piece of company news. It would have been the kind of announcement that moved a market overnight, exactly the kind of announcement the men who controlled the big bonanza 6 years earlier had known how to use before making it public. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. No announcement came, no news item in the Territorial Enterprise or the Gold Hill Daily News from that summer mentions a strike at the Alpine, and the local papers of the district were not shy about reporting rich finds, however small, since a rumor of a new bonanza sold papers as reliably as it moved stock. No filing describing new ore reserves appears among the county mining claim records for the Alpine that survive at the Story County Recorder's Office, records that are themselves incomplete for the 1870s, a gap local archivists attribute in part to the Great Fire and in part to the ordinary attrition of documents through a district that changed hands, changed names, and changed fortunes many times over in a single decade. What exists instead is absence, a promise in a minute book that the assay results would be reported, a deposit register that shows the Alpine's shipments simply stopping for the balance of the year, and, eventually, the mine itself. Alpine stock, thinly traded even in good years, shows no unusual movement in the surviving newspaper stock tables from that summer. No spike, no rumor, no sudden interest from outside buyers. Either the ore Kerrigan assayed was never as rich as the fragments suggest, or someone with access to his figures made certain that the market never learned of them before that access could be turned into something more useful than a public announcement. The mechanism by which such a thing could happen required no conspiracy in the dramatic sense, only ordinary self-interest operating inside a system that made concealment easy and profitable. A superintendent who received Kerrigan's report before the board did would have had, in the space between reading it and forwarding it, an opportunity available to almost no one else in the district. The chance to buy Alpine shares at their current depressed price before the figures that would justify a higher one became known to anyone else. Comstock superintendents were not merely company employees. Many held shares in the companies they managed, bought stock in rival claims, and moved fluidly between mining management and speculation in a district where the two activities were barely distinguished from one another. The bonanza firm's own conduct in 1873, buying up shares for months before revealing what their drifts had found, was not treated by their contemporaries as a scandal requiring justification. It was treated as shrewd business, the kind of maneuver every ambitious man on the Comstock understood, and given the chance, would likely have attempted himself. If the Alpine superintendent, a man the surviving minute books name only as E. Poole, recognized what Kerrigan's figures could mean and chose to sit on them rather than forward them immediately, he would have been following a well-worn path rather than inventing a new one. There is also a simpler possibility, one that requires no scheming superintendent at all. Ore bodies on the Comstock were notoriously unpredictable in their extent. A pocket of high-grade ore could run a few feet and pinch out entirely, swallowed by barren rock on every side, and a mine that seemed on the verge of a second bonanza one week could be back to ordinary ground the next. It is possible that Kerrigan's sample represented exactly that, a narrow, isolated pocket that the drift passed through and left behind within days, and that the report was never forwarded simply because by the time anyone above Kerrigan would have acted on it, there was nothing left to act on. A superintendent with nothing to announce had little reason to record in writing a discovery that no longer existed by the time the next shift went down. Under this reading, the silence in the record is not evidence of concealment at all, only of a strike that came and went too quickly to matter, the kind of thing that happened somewhere on the Comstock nearly every month and was rarely worth a permanent entry in anyone's books. The surviving fragments of the story do not allow a choice between these explanations. They allow only the observation that both were entirely plausible in a district built, in equal measure, on real mineral wealth and on the manipulation of information about it. What happened to Kerrigan himself is harder to trace than what happened to the paperwork. The Virginia city directories, published annually to list residents and their occupations, show a Silas Kerrigan working as an assayer in the district through the spring of 1879. The 1880 directory does not list him. He does not appear in the Story County census taken that year, nor in any surviving Comstock Company payroll after that summer. Men left the district constantly as the boom cooled and mines cut their payrolls, and an assayer's disappearance from a company town's directory is, on its own, unremarkable. Dozens of skilled men left the Comstock every month by 1880, as the district's population began its long decline from a peak of roughly 25,000 toward the few thousand who would remain by the end of the decade. Assayers in particular were portable men, trained in a skill that mining camps across the West competed for, and it would have taken nothing more than a better offer from Leadville or Tombstone or one of a dozen other booming districts to explain Kerrigan's absence from the following year's directory. But the timing sits uncomfortably close to the gap in the record, close enough that it invites a question the surviving documents cannot answer on their own. Did Kerrigan leave because the work was drying up, as it was for hundreds of others that year, or did he leave because he had seen something, said something, or been paid to say nothing, and found the district no longer had a place for him once the matter was settled? The one piece of evidence that speaks, if it speaks at all, in Kerrigan's own voice rather than in the silence of a ledger, surfaced almost a century later, when a family in Ohio donated a small collection of 19th-century correspondence to a regional historical society, later transferred into the broader Comstock manuscript holdings, now consulted by researchers at the University of Nevada, Reno. Among the letters, addressed to a sister named Margaret and signed only with the initial S, is one undated page describing conditions in an unnamed Nevada mining camp that match the Comstock closely enough that archivists have tentatively associated it with Silas Kerrigan, though the attribution remains unconfirmed and the family's own records of the connection are thin. If the letter is what researchers believe it to be, it opens not with the assay at all, but with the heat, describing an assay office where the crucible tongs were warm to the touch before the furnace was even lit, and a water barrel kept packed with ice, hauled down by rail, specifically so the men could chop it into their drinking water with a pick. The writer describes the sound of the Cornish pumps working somewhere below, a steady, mechanical breathing that never stopped day or night, and the particular quality of silence that settled over the assay office once the night shift ended and the ordinary noise of the works dropped away. It is against that backdrop, according to those who have examined the page, that the letter turns to the night in question, describing an assay that came back, in the writer's words, wrong twice in a row until he understood it was not wrong at all, and the strangeness of holding a result he knew would matter to a great many people before any of them knew it existed. The letter goes on to describe a conversation with a superintendent the writer does not name directly, and a decision the writer frames as being made for him rather than by him, though the surviving page breaks off before explaining what that decision was. No second page has been found. Whether one ever existed, or whether the story simply ends where the paper does, is not something the archive can resolve. What can be said with more confidence is what the letter does not claim. It does not describe buried treasure or a discovery beyond the explanatory reach of ordinary 19th-century mining geology. Native silver wire and stephanite in unusually rich concentration were not unknown on the Comstock. They were, in fact, precisely the minerals that had made the district famous in the first place. What the letter, if genuine, actually documents is not a scientific mystery but a human one, an ordinary man in an extraordinary position, holding a number that could move a market, in a district where the men around him had already shown, publicly and profitably, exactly what could be done with that kind of knowledge if a man was willing to keep quiet long enough to use it. The Alpine claim itself did not survive the Comstock's broader decline. Like most of the smaller independent companies on the southern end of the lode, it was absorbed, abandoned, or allowed to lapse sometime in the 1880s as the district's population and its ore reserves both continued to shrink, falling from a peak of roughly 25,000 residents toward a fraction of that number within a generation. Its shaft, along with dozens of others across the Comstock, was eventually left unmaintained, its timbers rotting, its lower levels filling again with the water the Sutro Tunnel had once drained away, since the tunnel itself required constant maintenance that no one had an economic incentive to provide once the mines it served stopped producing. The tunnel still exists today, mostly impassable to visitors and largely closed to the public beyond a restored section near its portal, still carrying hot water out of the mountain more than a century after it was built for that exact purpose. A working piece of 19th century engineering that continues to do its job long after the boom it was built to serve has ended. Somewhere beneath Virginia City and Gold Hill, the old workings of dozens of small companies like the Alpine remain interconnected through that drainage system, flooded, dark, and largely unmapped in any detail that a modern surveyor would trust. Virginia City today is a National Historic Landmark, its main street lined with restored buildings, its mines a stop on a heritage railroad that carries tourists over ground that once held some of the richest ore bodies on the continent. Visitors can descend a few hundred feet into one or two of the old workings that have been made safe for the purpose, enough to feel the temperature climb and to understand, in a small way, what Kerrigan and men like him faced every working night of their lives. The Alpine's own shaft is not among the sites open to the public. Like most of the district's smaller claims, its collar was fenced off decades ago, and its timbers have long since given way, leaving little more than a depression in the hillside to mark where it once stood. Researchers with the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology still study the district's underground temperatures, using the same gradient Church described in 1879 to understand the geothermal potential of a mountain that has not stopped generating heat simply because the mines that once measured it went quiet. The company records that survived from the boom years are scattered across several institutions: the University of Nevada's Special Collections, the Nevada Historical Society in Reno, private family papers that surface occasionally when an estate is settled or an attic is cleared, and none of those collections is complete. Historians who work with them describe the Comstock's documentary record as a landscape with holes in it, some the size of a single missing page, others the size of an entire company's papers, lost to fire, to neglect, or simply to the fact that no one in 1880 thought a mining company's assay book was worth preserving for people who had not yet been born. No assay ledger for the Alpine Mining Company survives past the middle of 1879. No mint record shows what, if anything, came up from that lower drift after the last week of June. No newspaper announced a strike, and no stock rally followed one. What survives is a promise made in a minute book and never kept in writing, a federal deposit register that goes quiet at exactly the moment the promise was made, and a single undated page in a stranger's handwriting that may or may not belong to the man who ran the crucible that night. The mountain that holds the Comstock's old workings does not distinguish between the mines that made their owners famous and the ones that disappeared from the record without a sound. It holds them the same way, filled with water that no longer rises the way it once did, in tunnels no one has walked in decades, keeping whatever Silas Kerrigan found, or did not find, exactly as silent as the company books that were supposed to write it down. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.